Hey friends, we're off here again with the Louisville ProActivist Report. Thanks for joining me today. If you've been keeping up, you know I'm doing this series interviewing people who are involved in the Breonna Taylor protests, which brings me to my guest today. I wanted to bring you all a legal perspective from an attorney, just to let you all, kind of see that side of it. So my guest today is attorney David Mour. Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
So let's just kind of get into it. I don't see a lot of attorneys involved in this, at least not on a personal level, and I see you out all the time. So kind of what took your interest about this, and how did you get so involved in this whole situation?
Thank you, Rolf. I actually originally got involved after the first weekend of protests in Louisville, which I guess was the last weekend in May of 2020. I was not down here that initial Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Sunday, I'd come down to my office, which is downtown, and just to kind of check on things. And I was rolling back home towards where we live, and I'd gone through St. Matthews, and there was a large gathering of folks protesting in, I call it downtown St. Matthews, where the old White Castle used to be. I would say there were a good several hundred people, and I drove through, honked my horn. I got home. I have a teenage daughter who I just remarked to her, hey, they're protesting in St. Matthews, and she said, I want to go. And I asked her why, because I was looking for a correct reason to protest, not just because it's fun or cool. She has two first cousins who are half African American, and she said if I don't stand up for, and she named them, if I don't stand up for my little first cousins, who will? To me, as a father, that was the right answer. And we went out to St. Matthews that afternoon, that evening, and the next day we came downtown. And I've been down here. I've missed one night. I went to Litchfield. Some folks out there from BLM, the movement BLM, asked me to accompany them on a protest where there were some threats. And in my opinion, the Commonwealth Attorney out there issued some public statements that sort of invited people to cause trouble that I thought was inappropriate. I let that be known to him that was inappropriate, and I went out there. And to the credit of law enforcement out there that night, the sheriff and the police chief of Litchfield, they stood in the square with me and with the protesters, and I thought that was a good representative thing to do on behalf of law enforcement, to stand shoulder to shoulder with folks that were protesting racial injustice and some problems in law enforcement. So that's how I got into it.
Nice. That's a really cool story there. So let's get right into it. So the night that Breonna Taylor died, just kind of give us your initial. I'm asking this of everybody on this. Give us your initial thoughts when you heard the news, and then talk about the legal perspective that you had when you heard about it.
It's funny because I have practiced law in Louisville for 34 years, and I've if I'm lucky, I'll be 60 years old in a few months, and I've been in this town a long time. I went to first grade here, so do the math, that's about 54 years. I know a lot of people in town. I've been around this town a lot. I've represented a lot of folks in this town, not large corporations, big companies. I've always represented the mom and pop businesses and, Joe and Jane on the street. I had a job in college that made me very familiar with the west end of Louisville. And it just so happens that I have a sister-in-law who, her children are the two little African-American kids that I mentioned about my daughter. She has another son that lives with her. They live, I think it's the next building or maybe two buildings down from Breonna Taylor. So we knew about the shooting that night because that kid texted my wife and said, hey, they're shooting down here. So I've been pretty familiar with it from the get-go. I'm in that courthouse. Our courthouse is literally 2, 3, 4 days, sometimes 5 days a week. So I hear everything kind of that goes on in the legal system. When I first found out about it, I was, LMPD, nothing they do over the last decade surprises me. It has unfortunately become, I refer to them kind of jokingly, but kind of not, as the terrorist organization known as LMPD. And that's kind of the persona they've taken on, in my opinion. And I think it's become a culture of deceit, dishonesty, lack of transparency, violence, aggression, and brutality perpetrated against the people of this community, in particular, the people in the African American community. Now, when that happened, didn't surprise me. I'm familiar with no-knock warrants, have been for years. I'm familiar with the way the police operate, with the way the courts operate with regard to search warrants. And I have said for a long time that we have a huge problem in policing and in America. And what has happened is in the last, and it's really become prevalent since 9/11, and that is a lot of our police are ex-military, and they were in Afghanistan, and they've been overseas, and they were in Iraq. And there's a big difference between the training of soldiers, they're trained to kill, and the training of what are supposed to be civilian peace officers. That training, the difference in that training is huge. There's a huge gulf there. And what has happened that I've seen as a defense lawyer, I do a lot of criminal defense, what I've seen in the last 15, 20 years is law enforcement, police have lost the ability to de-escalate, to ratchet it down, to walk away from something they really don't need to be involved in. Combine that with the war on drugs that has been going on. I graduated from college with a police administration degree in 1982. The war on drugs has pretty much been going on since then. And we've been fighting the war on drugs in America with the courts and the police. It's a fail. It's been a fail from the beginning. It's never worked. We are not going to cure the drug problem, the addiction problem in America with long prison sentences, with police, with courts. We're going to cure the problem with drugs in America and addiction in America with better education, better health care, better social services, better neighborhoods, better communities, family relations. And when I say better health care, I mean mental health care and physical health care. That's how we're going to cure the war on drugs, or the drug problem in America. The war on drugs has to be fought at the social services level, education level, healthcare level, not with the courts, not with the police. And that's what we've been doing. So what I've seen in the last 20 or so years is that problem with law enforcement, the inability to ratchet it down, to de-escalate. And if you, particularly a lot of young police officers, if you question or challenge their authority in any way, shape, or form, it's on. And if you're black, it's really on. And it may be on to the extent that you're not going home that night and maybe ever. And I've been saying that for years. I've seen it in the courts. I've seen it with the police, and it's a problem. And that manifested itself in the killing of Breonna Taylor on March 13th, 2020. And probably the cops caught a break 2 days later with that, because America shut down. If you remember, the next Monday was when all the shutdowns, and I went out to eat for a family member's birthday that Sunday, and I believe Tuesday was St. Patrick's Day. Everything was closed by then. That's when that happened, and that kind of shut it down. People forgot about it. Corona was the big issue, the COVID, the shutdowns and the arguing over that we had. What really brought the Breonna Taylor thing back to life was George Floyd. That's what happened. And that kind of brought it back to life. And, what do I think about what happened there? That entire operation, that is the undercover operation that resulted in that raid that night where she was killed, in my opinion, is a complete and total, and there's no other way to say it, it was a complete and total clusterfuck. They had arrested the individual they were actually looking for an hour or so before they even went into her home. I believe Officer Mattingly in his statement said that they thought she was home by herself. The search warrant affidavit, which was prepared by an LMP detective by the name of Josh James, and just to again show you what, sometimes I feel like I got into this movement because, I don't know, a force pushed me into it because I know so many people involved in it. The detective who completed the search warrant affidavit, his name is Josh James. His wife and her twin sister were my daughter's babysitters from the time she was about born until she didn't need a babysitter anymore. My daughter was the flower girl at Josh James' wedding to his wife, who's also an LMPD officer. That search warrant, in my opinion, if not completely false, is misleading. The information, I believe, on that warrant was stale. And I've said all along, we need to, and people don't understand, defund the police. Obviously, in a society, a country of 330 million people, metropolitan areas, Louisville's what now, 1.5 million, we have to have law enforcement. I mean, without it, it's chaos. But law enforcement in America, including in Louisville, needs to be, our police department needs to be dismantled from the top to the bottom. It needs to be restructured and assets reallocated. And we send police officers with, I had a police administration degree in college, a BS in police administration. And I'll tell you what that BS stands for, and it's not Bachelor of Science. Police officers, you know, we send somebody with no college degree or with a Bachelor of Science in Police Administration maybe into a domestic quarrel, a domestic situation. Police officers aren't qualified to deal with that, to understand, they don't have the time when they're on the shift. They don't have the training, they don't have the knowledge. And I know they get training on domestic violence and, you know, how to diffuse these things. That's not enough. Police officers should have degrees in sociology, in counseling, in human behavior and health. Training needs to be varied. I believe police officer salaries and pay needs to be increased. And, you know, I've gotten a lot of criticism from people that look like me, and they say, you know, you hate the police, you're a police hater, you don't respect the police, you want to destroy the police, you want to defund the police. That is absolutely false. As I have explained publicly, I have explained, I have a police administration degree from U of L, University of Louisville. My last year of undergrad, first year law school, I was a small city policeman in Eastern Junction County. My own brother is a retired United States Capitol policeman. One of my best friends for years and years was a high-ranking member of the Louisville Division of Police. I was when I was in law school, I was hired as a law clerk by a small law firm that had a contract at the time with the old LPD as a legal advisor. They hired me because of my law enforcement education and background. When I graduated, I went to work for them, with them. I worked on that contract with LPD for a couple of years until they started hiring in-house legal advisors. I was a attorney for one of our local smaller departments, not LPD, Shively. I was an FOP attorney for a number of years. I was a city attorney for a small city in Western Kentucky for several years, represented their police department. They have a fine police department. Their chief is one of the most honorable police officers I've ever met. I support law enforcement 100%. I back police 100% when the police are honest, transparent, and when they respect the constitutional, civil, and human rights of every single citizen, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like, no matter their color, no matter their religion, regardless. And unfortunately, LMPD in the last decade is none of the above. And that, a police department that is dishonest, is not transparent, does not respect the civil, constitutional, and human rights of all of its citizens. I do not respect that. I do not support that, and that's what we have, and that's what we must change. But we can't just change the police department. We have to change as a people. Yes, we have to dismantle the police departments, rebuild them, restructure them. But we also have to change the framework and set of rules and regulations and guidelines under which they operate. Because if we don't change that, we're wasting our time changing the police agencies. And when I say the framework, for example, no-knock warrants, we can't have that. That invites unlawful, wrongful criminal conduct by police agencies, and the result of those things is where we are right now with the Breonna Taylor situation. Another example is the immunity that's given to police officers to act, qualified immunity. It's because you're basically giving them a license to do whatever in the hell they want to do to whomever they want to do it, and they can't be sued. They can be sued, but it's very, very difficult to prove claims against law enforcement. That section, you know what a 1983 action is. Federal civil rights claims, civil actions are routinely dismissed by federal courts, causing parties to have to go to appellate courts if they want. A lot of people don't have the money and the resources to do that. So the qualified immunity has got to go, or at least be minimized and stripped away. The other thing we've got to change is we must stop allowing the police to police themselves. It's a fail. And is, you know, I've been an advocate for a long time for an agency independent of the courts, the prosecutors' offices, and in Louisville, of course, in Kentucky, we have the Commonwealth Attorney and the County Attorney. Those are our two bodies of prosecutors. Independent of them, independent of the police department, a separate agency that investigates use of force, and in particular, deadly use of force by police officers, and major acts of misconduct and allegations of misconduct by police officers. Now, if a police officer is in trouble because he shows up for work late, obviously this board wouldn't get involved in that, but major acts of misconduct by police officers that would constitute crimes at the same time. We need an agency that maybe has a board of, say, 9 people, 3 police officers, maybe a couple of judges, a couple of lawyers, and then people from a cross-section of the community to adjudge and adjudicate misconduct and use of force by these officers. That agency should have subpoena power. It should have its own investigators. It should have its own executive director. And those investigators should have the power of arrest. And that would be a huge step towards cleaning up the police, is that independent agency. So when I say the framework from which the police operate, that's what I'm talking about.
Have you looked into the Cincinnati Citizens Review Board?
I have. I'm familiar with that, and I know how it operates. I don't know what studies there are as to how it's doing, so to speak, but I can tell you this: anything's got to be better than what we have. And another problem that we have, and in a couple of days, I'm going to have a press conference. I have a lawsuit against the sheriff's office, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office right now, where a young man was on the front steps of the Hall of Justice and through the locked chain doors was sprayed in the face by a major with OC spray, pepper spray. I've done some investigating and digging into the sheriff's office, and I'm going to announce a revelation about the sheriff's office and call for the sheriff's resignation, because there's some things that have happened in that department that are just outrageous. I don't care what color you are, they're outrageous. More on that later. But one of the issues that I've discovered there, and one of the incidents was, and one of the problems we've had in law enforcement in the last few years is we'll have these, there'll be an officer under investigation by an agency for wrongdoing, unlawful conduct, and they allow that officer to retire or resign, shut the file down, and what happens? That officer is hired by another agency. And we had an incident a few years ago where we had I believe it was a female detective who was accused of all sorts of misconduct as an LMPD detective. They allowed her to retire. She was hired by another local agency, not in Jefferson County, and guess what happened? She did the same thing there she had done to people in Jefferson County. So it's got to change. I mean, we can't continue as a country to allow these things to happen. And you know, fortunately, I'm older, and when I look at technology that we have today, there's a lot of really bad things about the technology of today that I don't like. Social media is one of the worst inventions, I think, in the history of man. But at the same time, there are some good parts of social media, and it does have some effective uses. And what has changed the narrative in policing is these. And you wonder how many George Floyds there were before cell phone cameras. And if you remember, the Rodney King incident was before cell phones, but it just so happened there was a gentleman across the street that night. Back in the 80s and 90s, I remember the first, video cameras, camcorders they called them, they were huge. They looked like they were massive. And a guy happened to be on his porch and saw the LAPD officers beating Mr. King and captured it on video. Otherwise, if that hadn't happened, we'd have never heard of it. And then there was an incident a few years ago, I think it was in South Carolina, where a police officer shot a fellow that he claimed had turned and pointed a gun at him. And it turned out there was a gentleman across a fence line that saw the whole thing and videoed it. And the officer was caught. I think the officer went to prison for that because he killed the guy. But the technology, fortunately, has changed the narrative. And one of the big things in Louisville has been the live streamers, which has really, really changed the narrative. Because in the past, and I've called out LMPD on a number of occasions during the protest I've called it LMPD out over two things. One, their continued aggression towards peaceful protesters. With the exception of even the first night, I wasn't there, but I've seen a lot of the video, and it appears to me as though those were police riots. That phrase was coined in 1968 at the Democratic National Convention. There was a report done after that called the Walker Report, where they studied what happened over those days in June in Chicago in 1968. And it was determined that most of the rioting was what they now call police riots. It was initiated by over-aggressive, over-militarized police activity, which basically was the attack by police on peaceful protesters. That's what's happened in Louisville. At the end of the day, when it comes out, that's what it's going to be, I predict. And there's literally thousands of hours of footage on people's cell phone cameras, and the live streamers will be able to show it too. And what has happened, and I met with LMPD, the chief, and some of the command staff on July 3rd. That was already a month and a half ago. And the purpose of the meeting was kind of to open dialogue about what's going on and how we can, better communicate and maybe avoid some of the things that have been happening. And I told them at that meeting, and I said, LMPD, in my opinion, is the lyingest of liars. And your credibility in this community, not just with the African American community, but I think with a lot of people, is less than zero. And the reason is because they continually misrepresent and lie about what's happened. And there's a reason for that. In the past, before these and before live streaming, LMPD would hand a story to the media and say, here's what happened. And the mainstream media, the network affiliates, the newspaper, would lap it up and believe whatever LMPD said. And the last few months have shown that we can't do that anymore. That, LMPD has said so many things here's what happened tonight. And the live stream, which is boots on the ground from the beginning of an event to the end, and folks standing around with cell phone cameras, shows that's not what happened. So until they stop that and are honest and transparent about events that occur, and they stop this unnecessary aggression towards peaceful protesters, I don't see things changing.
And I like that you brought that up about the live streamers. It's one of the reasons I live stream is, to document and to protect the protesters, because we know that if the press even talks about it, which often they don't, you're not likely to get the truth with that. So it's good to have another view of that.
I'll give you an example of where you're exactly right on that. It's been about a month, but they have their riot vehicle. They call it a Bearcat. I call it their tank. And they claimed one evening that it was rammed by a protester vehicle. That was an absolute lie, and they knew it was a lie. And it happened before July 3rd, because at that meeting I called them out on that. I said, "Why did you all lie about that?" Well, their spokesperson Jesse Halliday said, "Oh well, David, we looked at other videotape after we put out that release and put out that story, and we realized that we were incorrect." And I'm like, well, wait a minute. You're cops. Your job is to investigate things. As a lawyer, I don't put out my statement, my complaint. If there's an incident and there's 10 videos, before I file my complaint, I'm not watching 5. I'm not watching 7 or 9. I'm watching all 10. And I told them, you didn't watch these because you didn't want to. You knew what happened. You put that story out. I know why you did it. Don't sit there and act like it was innocent. You flat lied and you got busted. And that's what's happened. I sued LMPD and Louisville Metro Monday a week ago. And the reason why I sued them was that Sunday they had put out the ROE of no marching in the street, no protesting in the street. And the basis of that order, directive, whatever you want to call it, was the night before, that Saturday evening, they claimed that a truck up on Broadway was attacked by protesters. And what they did was they took one of the live streamers, they took a snippet of his live stream, and it showed protesters banging on this truck.
I remember that.
Yeah, well, I happened to have been in the protest line behind that truck and saw what happened. That truck inserted itself into the line and rammed a vehicle in front of it intentionally 2 or 3 times. It was then that the protesters attacked that truck. Now, I'm not justifying whatever the protesters did or didn't do, and I'm not saying those people deserved that, but they were not protesters. They were not pure of heart. They were there to cause trouble. They inserted themselves into the caravan. They rammed a vehicle. They were using racial epithets at the kids that were protesting and walking. One of them flicked a cigarette at a kid. I observed that they were drinking. They were there to cause trouble, and they got what they asked for. They got trouble. And it wasn't good trouble. It was bad trouble, because they were not there to protest racial injustice or the treatment of African Americans by police. They were there to stir up stuff, and they stirred it up good. And so when LMPD showed that little snippet of video, it was completely misleading. It was a half-truth. It didn't tell the whole story. And then the other part that night was the alleged destruction of 4th Street Live, which was another lie. Some tables and chairs were knocked over by protesters. I'm not justifying it. I don't endorse. I don't condone. I'm not for violence. Sometimes it happens. I don't agree with it. I'm an officer of the court. I can't agree with it. Some tables and chairs were knocked over that night. LMPD had put up a live stream saying the destruction at 4th Street. They realized there was no destruction at 4th Street. Other protesters picked up the tables and chairs that had been knocked over. And I submit to you, before Corona on a good Friday or Saturday night, if they had 400 or 500 people, I bet a couple of tables got knocked over and broken. But the next day they used these misleading stories to justify the ROE. I called them out on it that Sunday and said, our statute specifically allows marching in the streets so long as traffic can pass, and a law enforcement order to stop protests in the street if traffic can pass is unlawful. Called them out. That night they tried to stop marching in the street. LMPD completely lost control of a crowd of 100, 150, mostly teenage kids that were protesting. They charged them. They broke a line. It was a disaster. Monday I filed my suit. After I filed my suit, since then, they've backed off and allowed, so long as cars can pass, they've allowed marching in the street, as they should. Now, I got a lot of criticism with that lawsuit from people that look like me, because the allegation is I'm trying to keep the police from enforcing the law and protecting property. And what those folks don't understand is that lawsuit, sure, it's in the movement, and it's for a group that I represent that's in the movement, Firm Initiative Incorporated. But that lawsuit was about everybody's right to protest. Because I don't give a damn if you want to go out in the street and bitch that you don't want to wear a mask, or complain you don't want to pay higher taxes, or the governor's a jerk, or you're against Donald Trump, or Black Lives Matter, or you want to support the police. If you want to march in the street, the government can't tell you that you can't do that. As long as it can be done in a manner which doesn't obstruct the flow of traffic, the government can't tell you that. And you know, in our state constitution, Kentucky, people don't realize this. Freedom of speech is so important to Kentuckians. It's mentioned twice in our Constitution. It's in Section 1 with the freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all that. It's also in Section 8 on its own. So freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, the right to protest, is sacrosanct to Americans and to Kentuckians. And when I see government say, we're just going to put a total ban on that, I'm not going to let that happen. Here I come. And that's what I did. Now, since then, like I said, they've let it go on. It's been peaceful. We'll see this weekend how that holds.
And protesting is so important. It was literally guaranteed in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, meaning, you know, that was one of the very first things that came to their mind when writing that. So,
well, you know, it kills me. I hear people all over town talk about, you know, conflate protesters with rioters. And that is so ridiculous, because there's been one night of rioting in Louisville. I submit to you, much of that violence was precipitated by the police. Now, in any large crowd, large movement, I mean, when UK wins the NCAA basketball tournament, they have 20,000 people in Lexington celebrating. They have 500 idiots that want to turn over police cars or set them on fire or burn couches, in the middle of the street. And that's the human condition. You're always going to have that. I mentioned to somebody the other day, I don't even know what day we're on now, 80-something. Is today day 85 or 85?
Yeah.
85 days of protests where you figure, you know, there's been anywhere from 100 to 200 to maybe 300. When you add up all the marches and protests that have happened, you're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of people marching in the streets, protesting, having rallies, and, you know, miles and miles and miles of marching. I mean, am I going to sit here and say there's been no protesters that have done stupid things? Well, of course not. I mean, you're always going to have idiots in a crowd that are going to do stupid things. Now, looting, that's not protesting. And I have a client that owns a jewelry store. The first night of protest, when the riots did happen, and the criminals knew that the police were mostly downtown occupied with protesters, somebody stole a truck and drove through the front of my client's jewelry store through the chain thing, did $30,000 damage to the property, stole some jewelry, stole some weapons in there. That's what happens. You're going to have, just like you got bad apples in law enforcement, you're going to have bad apples out there in a protest. And you're going to have agitators, instigators come in town, criminals, just to take advantage of a, you know, civil disturbance and something like that. That's going to happen.
Yeah.
You know.
So switching gears just a little bit, I wanted to get your take on what happened to David McAtee, you know, a man who was shot in his own business in a spot where there were no protests going on, and yet the National Guard was there. So what's your take on that whole situation?
You know, I don't, that was, I believe, Monday night of that first week. And my take on that is this. I don't know who fired first. I watched the New York Times. They did a frame by frame thing. I don't know at this point. But I'll tell you this. You always have to go to the seed that is planted that grows the tree. And I'm going to give you an example. On the night of July 9th, my daughter was assaulted by at least one, maybe two female LMPD officers in the parking garage behind the old jail building. And, you know, I listened to people say, you know, well, they were in a place they shouldn't have been. And, you know, the LMPD put out after that it was necessary. The whole thing started with shooting pepper balls at protesters from the roof of the old jail building who were on the street, which never should have happened. And they put out a narrative that there was a vehicle that came out of the parking garage and it was surrounded by protesters, and they had to shoot at the protesters with pepper balls to disperse that crowd, okay? I was there that night too. That is a false statement. That is wrong. The shooting at protesters started 20, 30, maybe 40 minutes before the car exited from the parking garage onto Army Place. At the time that car exited until that car left the scene, There was no shooting of pepper balls at protesters by LMPD, period. It's on video. LMPD was not truthful about that. My point is, that entire episode that night, and people said, well, it looks like your daughter tripped, and it looks like she wasn't pulled down. The seed that was planted that night that caused that entire disturbance was police officers who fired less than lethal weapons in violation of their use of force policy, because you don't shoot pepper balls at protesters from the neck up. And you sure don't shoot them from above, because when people hear the pop, pop, pop from above, the natural human reaction is to look up, which can cause you to catch one of those in the eye and kill you, potentially. It has happened. Or if you catch one of those in the eye, I doubt there's a surgeon anywhere in the world that can save that eye. So that entire riot that night was a police riot caused by over-aggressive action of LMPD. They planted that seed. That's what happened. The night David McAtee was killed, there was no protest. I met him a couple of times and ate at his place. They were partying down there. That's a regular Sunday night event in the warm weather at Yaya's place, where it's a community thing. People eat food, people celebrate, people play music. That's what they were doing. Now, were they in violation of the curfew that night? Maybe. I don't know. I don't even remember what time it was. But I submit to you, if you drove around the county that night, there were people everywhere in violation of the curfew. And yet LMPD took it upon itself to go down to the West End. They took the National Guard down there with them. And have we not learned in America, when you employ the National Guard in civil disturbances and riots, protests, whatever you want to call it, did we not learn that at Kent State? Did we not learn that? I think there was another incident in the 70s. It might have been Ohio U, where a couple of National Guardsmen shot students. And now we have David McAtee down the West End. The cops never should have been there in the first place. I blame LMPD for David McAtee's death. There was no reason for the police to be there. Had they not gone down in there, David McAtee would be alive today.
You talked about a parking garage there. Let's talk about a different one, because you did some work where you uncovered some information about some snipers that had been in another parking garage.
Right.
So talk about that a little bit, what you found out and everything that goes with that.
Well, I have theorized from the beginning of the protests, and even before that I believe that there are quite a few, I'm going to use that language, quite a few members, rank and file members of LMPD, and I believe the Sheriff's Office, of police officers that are either sympathetic to or members of these militia groups, 3%ers, patriot groups, whatever you want to call them. And the night that if you remember, the night Tyler Girth was tragically killed, which was June 27th, it was a Saturday. That was the weekend that the patriot groups were supposedly coming in town to take back downtown. We have some of that coming up this weekend, I understand.
Yeah, outside agitators.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they did not show up in mass, at least publicly, that weekend. There was maybe 7, 8, 10 of them that we saw from the square. The night seemed to go, the day seemed to be fairly peaceful. That night, unfortunately, Tyler Girth died. The following Monday, there was a little, just kind of a really quick news story. I believe it was on WDRB. And the essence of the story was that LMPD had pulled some snipers off the roof of a parking garage in downtown Louisville on Sunday night, the night after Tyler was killed. Well, as I already said, we met, the leadership and I met with the LMPD leadership on Friday of that week, which was a holiday, but we met anyway. It was July 3rd. At the end of that meeting, I said, hey, I have a question, just curious. I read this story on WDRB about snipers. I didn't really believe it. And I said, how much truth is there to that? And they said, the LMPD folks said, well, it's true. And I said, don't you think that that's information that should be, passed on to the folks in the square whose safety is at risk out there, and if you know where that parking garage is behind the Hyatt, which to the north is Jefferson, which is a protest route. To the south is Liberty, which is the out route. Jefferson's the in route. It's a perfect place to, kill a police officer and blame protesters, or just kill a protester. They said, yeah, it's true. And I said, shouldn't you tell us that? They said, well, you need to make an open records request. Thank you very much. And I said, all right, I'll do that. But just one question: how'd you find them? And LMPD, their folks said the helicopter, I think they call it Air 20, the helicopter. Okay, so on Monday the 6th, I made an open records request. I had to sue them to get anything, and it was the Thursday, the weekend before NFAC came into Louisville. I filed suit that Thursday because they were stonewalling me. Friday, we had a hearing before the judge in the case. They actually turned over some information before the hearing. Now they've turned a lot of information over to me since then. But the bottom line was this: LMPD lied about how they found the snipers. It wasn't the helicopter that actually spotted them. A citizen saw some guys on the roof with guns, called 911. Made the Metro Safe call. Well, at that point, LMPD knows we're busted if we don't rouse these guys out, and somebody gets shot, and it comes out, and it would come out that a 911 call was made. We got a big problem. So they did send the helicopter up. They sent the SWAT team up there, grabbed them, detained and restrained them, according to the reports. It was a 21-year-old and a 17-year-old. They had a 30-06 and a 30-30 with scopes, with a bipod, which that's, to steady a weapon. They weren't actually on the rooftop. They were on I believe, the 5th floor of the garage. But ultimately, they were not charged with any crimes. I find it funny that 87 African-American protesters are sitting on the lawn of the Attorney General's office peacefully protesting and are charged with felonies. And these two idiots, who identified themselves as militia, they wouldn't identify what militia. The one individual, the adult, identified himself as a sovereign citizen. You know what they are. They let them go. Not only did they let them go, but according to the two individuals, they had been dropped off at the garage by friends earlier in the evening, and the LMPD officers gave them a ride to 3rd and Broadway to meet their militia buddies. Yeah. Now you tell me that there wasn't some familiarity there between the LMPD folks and the militia folks. And, a minor, the 17-year-old, can possess a long gun, a rifle, shotgun in Kentucky for certain purposes. One would be hunting. Another would be target practice at a legitimate range. A third would be on private property where they have permission of the owner. Well, these guys were obviously none of the above. The minor should have been detained. His parents contacted. The older adult should have been charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor and arrested, but they let him go. I submit to you, if those had been black guys on that roof, if not arrested, they'd been dead. Yeah.
And if there wasn't familiarity with the cops, there's at least, at the very least,
something's up.
Favoritism,
That one doesn't pass the smell test, does it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
So you brought up NFAC. Were you there that day when they came
Sure.
in? So you heard Grandmaster Jay speak? Then...
I was there. I don't necessarily subscribe to his philosophies, his ideologies. He has a problem with, I guess he called them white allies and what their role should be. I also kind of resented someone coming into our town and talking about burning it down and then leaving. This is my town. I grew up here. I live here. My business is here. My children are here. Grandkids are here. I don't want anybody burning this town down. But sure as hell don't come into our town from outside and say we're going to burn it down and then leave. A couple of them that afternoon between the formation of the street told me to get out of the street, and I told them, I'm not getting out of, these are my streets. You know, you're a guest in our town, you want to come into our town and march, have at it, but be polite. Don't tell us to get out of our streets. Because if you say that to us, then you're sort of taking on the message that LMPD has of ordering us around, and I didn't take too kindly to that. And most of a lot of the local protesters, I don't think the message of the NFAC appealed either, because, you know, I'm a white ally and I support the movement, and, you know, are they telling me to go away? You know, and here's the thing about that. This is my community, this is my town, as well as much as anybody's. And if I see racial injustice, if I see people treating unfairly, I'm going to stand up. I don't give a damn if some of the people who are being oppressed don't want me to. I'm going to.
So I wanted to get your take from a legal perspective on something specific that he said. Now, I don't remember exactly how he phrased it, but he basically was talking about doing citizens arrests against like some of our elected officials. So what kind of legal precedence is there for that, and how would that work if they were to do something like that?
You know, we do have a statute in Kentucky that permits citizens arrest, but it's rarely used, it's rarely invoked. I mean, I just don't give much credence to that. I mean, you know, people don't understand that, you know, there's a relationship between the police and the prosecutor's office about what is charged and then what is prosecuted. It's just like when they charged the 87 with felonies for sitting on the Attorney General's lawn. Well, you know, there's the legalities and looking at things in a vacuum of, okay, we just charged 87 people with a felony. But the realities of that is, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. If you charge people with felonies, you have to have a preliminary hearing to determine if probable cause exists. And I happen to, you know the county attorney real well, and we spoke about that, and I said, well, you're going to have 87 preliminary hearings in the next 20 days? I mean, there's realities and logistics of the legal system that, you know, that's why I hate shows on TV about cops and lawyers, because it's bullshit. I mean, you know, the old LA Law Show, the beginning of the 41 minutes, you know, when you count out the commercials and you get a case from walking in the door of the law firm to jury verdict in 41 minutes. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. So I don't put much, you know, I admire, is it Master J? Isn't that what he's called? Yeah. I admire Master J's passion and his commitment, but I don't necessarily agree with his methods and his ideology. And some of the things he says are just kind of, you know, you can try to arrest whoever you want. Good luck with that.
All right, so last question I have for
Sure.
you. So just, I believe it was last Sunday, Attica Scott came out and announced the pre-file of Breonna's law at the state level. So what's your opinion on this law? How effective do you think it's going to be?
I mean, I think, obviously, I'm not an advocate of no-knock warrants, because you end up with where we are. And I'm pleased that the council unanimously passed that, you know, banning it in Louisville. And I guess the theme is from the hood to the holler. You know, we need to, and that kind of gets into what I was talking about earlier, as far as changing the framework, the system from within which the police, the prosecutors, the courts work. And no-knock warrants got to go. I mean, there's just, I can't see the limited number of instances where they would be appropriate to allow it to happen. And we, you know, I've heard the stories about how they, you know, obtain that warrant, and the way it works is not a good system. The application for warrants and how it's meted out to judges and distributed to the judges and how the police do it, that's got to change. And the police need to be on the record. You know, right now, the police can go get a warrant and it's not on the record. There's no record made of the conversations and whatever they have with the courts. That's got to stop. And you know, I'm all for the legislation that they're proposing. I did listen to that press conference, and they were talking about a lot of things they wanted to throw into that bill, and they need to be careful because, the target right now is no-knock warrants, and if they try to attach too much to it, I think it's in danger of not getting out of committee. Now, I understand Bob Stivers is 100% for it right now, but that's the no-knock part. There's some other things in there that he may not be so much for, and you're going to get a hard lobby from law enforcement, especially the Kentucky State Police. So there's my take on that.
All right. That was all the questions I had. Did I miss anything, or is there anything else you'd like to address?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I'm here, I'm in it to win it, and hopefully it can be won without violence, without further conflict, damaging conflict in our community. I'm not sure that's possible. I think we're heading towards a major mistake by allowing 23,000 fans out at Churchill Downs to run the Derby on September 5th. I hope that clearer, more rational heads prevail and that can be stopped, because I see as many protesters in the street as there are people inside the Downs disrupting and cutting off traffic. And I don't think right now, I don't think we have I love Louisville. This is my hometown. The track is a symbol. Churchill Downs is a symbol of our community, for good or for bad. But I don't want it damaged. I don't want it harmed. I think right now, in this moment, I don't think we have a whole lot to celebrate about our city right now. I think we have a whole lot of work to do to come together as a community to talk, to have open dialogue, to discuss how do we fix the things that are wrong with our community? How do we fix the police department? How do we go forward to make Louisville a better place, not just for the white folks out in Prospect or St. Matthews, but for all of us? And I think we need to focus right now as a community on those things. We need to deal with COVID and get our community and our city through that. And I think maybe we could wait a year to have a horse race. A horse race really right now is not very important in the grand scheme of things. And I think about, Breonna Taylor's mom, and, does she really want to talk about a horse race right now? David McAtee's family, Tyler Grove's family, I think we got a lot bigger fish to fry in our community than worrying about a horse race in Louisville, Kentucky. Not to say a horse race isn't important to Louisville, Kentucky. It is, and it has been for years, and it can be again. But right now, it doesn't matter.
Agreed. So do you have any social media for either yourself or your firm that you'd like to put out there for people?
I have a Facebook page. Every once in a while, I'll make some of my posts public. I ask people, when you comment, you can disagree with me all day long till the cows come home. Do it respectfully. Do it in a manner that doesn't launch a personal attack. If you do it that way, I'll probably make a snarky comment back and block you, and you're gone forever. If you want to threaten me, don't do that, because if you do threaten me, and I've had some of that, I'm pretty good at what I do, and I'll find you, and I'll find you fast, and there'll be consequences for that, obviously, from law enforcement. But also, if you're going to criticize me or disagree with me, you can't use THERE when you meant THEIR, because I'll block you. I was raised by an education professor at the University of Louisville who taught me how to write and tortured me on my use of the English language. And if you're going to be, if you're going to disagree with me, you can't slay the King's English. I won't tolerate that. So spell check yourself.
My favorite is when somebody says you're an idiot and they spell you're wrong.
Right.
And it's like
it's wow, you are. Yeah. I'm like, no, you're the idiot. But that's there you go.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to come on. I know you're busy with your work and your activism and everything. You probably don't have a lot of free time, but thanks for giving me an hour.
You're welcome.
I just want to say, everybody out there, check for David Mour. If you're in town, you need an attorney. He's a good man. Look him up. Again, this is part of a series where I'm bringing you multiple interviews from multiple perspectives. So check out the ones I've got out on my pages. I'm working on some more interviews over the next few weeks, so be on the lookout for those. I'll be uploading those soon. So thanks again, David.
You're welcome.
To everybody watching, thank you so much for watching. I am local, independent, and nonprofit. You can help support local media by liking, sharing, following, pressing all those appropriate buttons. You can comment on this and boost my algorithms, and I greatly appreciate you. So until next time, just remember, always think critically.